mean I'll see it.
I've never really been the type of person to believe in the supernatural or those weird stories you read online late at night. I always thought there was a logical explanation for everything, a trick of the light, a tired mind, or just someone playing a cruel joke. But what happened when I was driving back from my sister's place has changed everything for me. I don't think I'll ever be able to drive at night again without staring at the rearview mirror until my eyes ache. It was one of those winter nights where the sky just opens up and tries to bury the world in white. The snow was coming down so thick that my high beams were basically useless, reflecting back off the flakes and creating this blinding wall of white right in front of my windshield. I was taking the back highway through the woods, a route I've driven 1,000 times, but in that weather, everything looked alien. The trees were just jagged, black skeletons reaching out from the gloom. I was crawling along at maybe 20 miles per hour, my neck stiff from leaning forward and squinting at the road. The heater was blasting, but I could still feel the chill seeping through the door seals. That's when I saw him. It happened so fast. 1 second the road was empty, and the next, my ABS was grinding and pulsing under my foot as I slammed on the brakes. A man was standing right in the center of the lane. He didn't move. He didn't even flinch as my car slid toward him, finally coming to a stop just a few feet from his knees. I sat there for a second, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I expected him to look angry or scared, but he just stood there. He wasn't wearing a winter coat. He wasn't even wearing gloves. He was just in this thin, red flannel shirt that looked wrong. It was stiff, almost like it had been dipped in water and then left out to freeze. It was clinging to his skin in a way that made me feel sick to my stomach. I could see the outline of his ribs through the fabric. His skin was a shade of pale that I didn't know humans could reach, a sickly, translucent blue-gray. I cracked my window just an inch, the freezing air cutting into the cabin like a knife. I was going to ask if he needed help, but the words died in my throat. When he spoke, his voice was so thin and brittle, it sounded like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He told me that I shouldn't stop here. He said that he was close. I remember the way his jaw moved. It was slow and heavy, as if the muscles were literally frozen solid. He didn't look at me. He just stared through the windshield at the empty passenger seat. Then, very slowly, he lifted one hand and pointed past my car, back into the swirling white of the blizzard. I did what anyone would do. I looked in the rearview mirror. At first, there was nothing but the red glow of my taillights reflecting off the snow. But then, something dark began to take shape. It was moving toward us from the tree line. It wasn't a person, at least, I hope it wasn't. It was way too tall, its limbs long and spindly like a spider's. It had this broad, hulking torso that didn't match the thinness of its legs. And the way it moved, it wasn't walking or running. It was this unnatural, jerky gait, like a film skipping frames. Every time it stepped, its whole body seemed to shudder and reset. The man in the flannel shirt leaned closer to my window, and I could smell him then. It wasn't the smell of the woods or the snow. It was the copper tang of old blood mixed with something sweet and rotting, like meat left in a freezer that had lost power. He whispered to me, telling me not to look at its face. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I rolled the window up so hard I thought the crank would snap and I floored it. I didn't care if I skidded into a ditch. I just had to get away from that thing and the frozen man who seemed to be waiting for it. As I sped away, I looked back one last time. The tall figure was already at the spot where I had been parked. It was sprinting now. It was keeping pace with my car, even as I pushed the needle past 40 on the icy road. It ran on all fours, its long arms reaching out and pulling its body forward in great, violent leaps. It stayed just on the edge of the red glow from my lights, a shadow that refused to be left behind. I could hear the faint thud of its weight hitting the road every few seconds, a heavy, wet sound that vibrated through the frame of the car. I was sobbing, though I didn't realize it at the time. I was just gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white, praying to a god I hadn't spoken to in years. The figure stayed with me for miles. Every time I thought I had lost it in a curve, I'd see that jerky, black shape reappear in the mirror, gaining ground. It was faster than any animal I'd ever seen. It was persistent in a way that felt personal. Eventually, the trees began to thin out and I saw the flickering neon sign of a 24-hour gas station in the distance. It was the only light for miles, a tiny island of safety in that frozen hell. I didn't even slow down as I turned into the lot, nearly taking out one of the pumps as I slid to a halt under the bright fluorescent lights. I sat there for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled, just staring at the darkness I had just come out of. Nothing followed me into the light. The road was empty. I must have sat there for 20 minutes before I had the courage to get out. My legs were shaking so badly I almost fell. I needed to see. I needed to know if I was just losing my mind. I walked around to the back of the car, and that's when the breath left my lungs. The entire trunk and the rear window were covered in a thin layer of frozen road salt and snow. And pressed into that white crust were handprints. Dozens of them. They weren't human. The fingers were too long, ending in sharp, jagged points that had scraped through the grime right down to the paint. But it wasn't just the handprints. Near the handle of the trunk, there was a smear of something dark. I touched it, and it was tacky, not yet fully frozen. It was blood. Deep, dark red blood that smelled exactly like the frozen man on the road. It looked as if someone had been clinging to the back of my car the entire time, their fingers digging into the metal, desperate to get inside. I went into the gas station to tell the attendant, but the kid behind the counter just looked at me like I was a junkie. He didn't see anything on the security cameras. He said the wind probably just blew some debris against my car. I didn't argue. I just bought a coffee I couldn't drink and sat in the brightly lit aisles until the sun started to come up. When I finally got home, I washed the car. I scrubbed until my hands were raw, trying to get those marks off the paint. But even now, when the light hits the trunk at a certain angle, I can still see the faint scratches where those long fingers tried to find a grip. And sometimes, when it's quiet and the wind picks up outside, I can still hear that dry, brittle voice telling me not to look. I keep thinking about that man in the flannel shirt. I keep wondering if he was trying to save me, or if he was just the bait. But mostly, I think about the fact that he said he's close. Not it. He. As if that thing used to be a person. As if it's still out there, wandering the back highways, looking for the next car to stop in the snow. I haven't been back to my sister's since then. She thinks I'm just busy, but the truth is, I can't bring myself to drive past those woods. I know what's waiting in the dark, and I know that next time, the man in the flannel shirt might not be there to give me a head start. Every time I see a tall shadow or hear a branch scrape against my bedroom window, I feel that same icy chill. It stays with you. It's a weight in the back of your mind that never really goes away.
Next story.
The storm was so heavy that by midnight, the snow reached the second-story eaves. The house was a tomb of white, cut off from the rest of the world by a drift that looked more like a wall than weather. I sat at the top of the basement stairs, counting the steps I'd known since I was a child. It was a habit from when I was small and afraid of the dark. Counting them kept my mind busy so I wouldn't imagine things reaching out from between the wooden slats. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 18. That was the floor of the cellar. A cold, concrete slab that always smelled like damp earth and old copper. But that night, in the absolute silence of the snow-muffled house, something changed. I wasn't even supposed to be awake, but the furnace had been making this rhythmic, white clicking sound for hours, and the air in the living room had turned thick with a smell I couldn't quite place. It was sweet, like rotting fruit, mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of an open wound. I went to the basement door, thinking maybe a pipe had burst or some animal had crawled into the vents to escape the frost and died there. I opened the door, and the cold that rolled up from the dark was different. It wasn't just the chill of a basement in winter, it felt like the breath of something that hadn't seen the sun in years. I sat on the top landing, my legs dangling over the edge, staring into the blackness. I started counting the steps in my head, just to steady my breathing. That's when I heard it. A heavy, wet thud. It didn't sound like a machine. It sounded like a piece of raw meat being dropped onto a table. It came from the darkness below. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it felt like it was trying to crack the bone. Then, the rhythm of a gait began. It was slow and deliberate. Something was coming up. Step 1. Step 2. I sat there, paralyzed, watching the line where the shadows met the faint light from the kitchen. My mind was screaming at me to move, to lock the door, to run into the snow, but my muscles were like lead. As the thing climbed, the smell got worse. It wasn't just rot anymore, it was the smell of a butcher shop left without power in the middle of July. It was the smell of infection and old, clotted blood. By the 10th step, I could hear the breathing. It wasn't human. It was a ragged, wet whistling sound, like someone trying to breathe through a throat full of broken glass. There was a wetness to every movement, a sliding sound of skin against wood. I stared down, and for a second, I thought I saw a flash of something white, not a face, but something like a bone-white mask, or maybe just skin stretched so tight over a skull that it had started to split at the seams. Step 15. Step 16. I waited for the handle to turn, for the 18th step to creak beneath the weight of whatever was hunting me. But then I heard the sound that truly broke my mind. A loud, splintering crack of wood, a 19th step, landing on the floorboards right next to my feet where no step existed. I scrambled backward, my heels digging into the carpet as I threw myself toward the kitchen. I didn't look back until I hit the far wall, grabbing a heavy butcher knife from the block. My vision was tunneling, but I could see the basement door was still wide open. A hand, if you could call it that, clamped onto the door frame. The fingers were long, far too long, and they looked like they'd been skinned. The muscle was a dark, bruised purple, glistening with a yellow film of pus. There were no fingernails, just jagged shards of bone protruding from the tips of the digits. It pulled itself into the light. It wasn't a monster from a movie. It was a man, or at least it had been once. He was naked, his skin a patchwork of different shades, some parts gray and leathery, others raw and weeping. He was covered in crudely stitched seams, thick black thread biting into the meat of his arms and torso. His face was the worst part. Someone had surgically removed his eyelids, leaving his milky, cataract-covered eyes to stare forever. His lips were gone too, peeled back to reveal gums that were black with decay and teeth that had been filed into jagged points. He didn't scream. He just looked at me, his head tilting at an angle that should have snapped his neck. He smelled of the cellar, of the hidden places where things go to die. As he moved toward me, I saw the trail he was leaving on the linoleum. It wasn't just blood. It was a trail of dark, viscous slime mixed with bits of hair and what looked like human teeth. I didn't think, I just swung the knife. The blade sank into his shoulder with a sickening, heavy thud. It felt like cutting into a pressurized bag of rotten meat. A spray of black, foul-smelling fluid erupted, hitting me across the face and mouth. It tasted like copper and bile. I gagged, retching as the intruder didn't even flinch. He just reached out with those bone-tipped fingers and gripped my forearm. The pain was immediate and white-hot. His claws sank through my skin, scraping against the radius bone. I could hear the sound of my own flesh tearing, a wet, ripping noise that seemed to echo in the silent house. He pulled me closer, his breath hitting my face. It was hot and smelled of fermented remains. He opened his mouth, and I saw that his tongue had been replaced by a sharpened piece of rusted metal, wired to the floor of his jaw. I kicked him in the chest, my boot sinking deep into the soft, unresisting cavity of his torso. It felt like kicking a bowl of thick porridge. He stumbled back, the knife still buried in his shoulder, and hit the kitchen island. I didn't wait. I bolted for the living room window. I didn't care about the snow or the cold. I threw myself through the glass. The shard sliced my arms and face, but the adrenaline was so high I barely felt it. I landed in a drift of snow that came up to my chest. I struggled, gasping for air, looking back at the window. He was standing there, framed by the jagged glass. He wasn't trying to follow me anymore. He was just watching. He raised his hand, the one that had gripped me, and I saw that he was holding a clump of my own skin and hair that he'd ripped away in the struggle. He didn't eat it. He tucked it into a flap of skin on his own chest, sliding it into a pocket of his own body as if he were saving it for later. I ran. I don't know how far I went through the snow, but eventually I reached the main road. A plow driver found me an hour later, curled in a ball, half frozen and screaming about the 19th step. The police went to the house the next morning. They found the blood in the kitchen. They found the knife, wiped clean and placed back in the wooden block. But they didn't find him. What they did find was behind the furnace in the basement. They found a space that shouldn't have been there, a narrow gap in the drywall that led to a hollowed-out crawl space beneath the living room floor. Inside, it wasn't just a squatter's nest. It was a gallery. There were hundreds of Polaroids pinned to the joists. Every single one of them was of me. Me sleeping. Me eating dinner. Me sitting on the basement stairs, counting the steps. The oldest photos were dated from years ago. He had been there the whole time. He had been under my feet, breathing the same air, watching through the vents. But the thing that keeps me awake, the reason I can't stay in any house with a basement anymore, is what they found in the very back of that crawl space. They found a pile of discarded parts. Scraps of skin, old bandages, and jars of teeth. And among the mess, they found a small, handwritten journal. There were no names in it, just a list of measurements. Dimensions for arms, for legs, for a torso. My measurements. He wasn't just living in my house. He was building himself a new suit. And he only needed a few more pieces to finish it. I still have the scars on my arm where his bone fingers dug in. Sometimes, when it's very quiet and the house settles, I find myself counting. Not the steps, but the heartbeats. And I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the last few inches of skin he needs to finally look just like me.
Next story.
I never told anyone the real reason I stopped hiking. I usually just tell people I blew out my knee or that I got bored of the trails, but that's a lie. The truth is much worse, and honestly, I'm still trying to convince myself that what I saw wasn't just some hypothermic hallucination. But I know it was real. I can still smell that metallic, copper tang of old blood and the scent of wet, matted hair whenever I close my eyes in a dark room. You know how those mountain storms can just swallow the world in seconds? That's how it started. I was up in the high country, way past the marked trails, thinking I was some kind of expert outdoorsman. Then the sky just turned this bruised, sickly purple color and the temperature dropped 40 degrees in an hour. The wind started screaming through the pines, and before I knew it, I couldn't see my own boots. It wasn't just snow, it was a wall of white static that erased the horizon. I was freezing, my fingers were turning that dull, waxy gray, and I knew if I didn't find shelter, I was going to be a headline by morning. I stumbled for what felt like hours, just pushing through drifts that came up to my waist until I literally walked into a wall. It was a cabin, or at least a shack made of heavy, unpeeled logs. It looked like it had been swallowed by the forest decades ago. I didn't even look for a doorbell or wonder who lived there. I just threw my shoulder against the heavy wood until the latch gave way. The heat hit me first. It wasn't the nice, dry heat of a wood stove, though. It was thick, humid, and smelled like a butcher shop that had lost its refrigeration. I stood there in the pitch black, my breath coming in these ragged, sobbing gasps, just trying to get my heart to slow down. I called out, asking if anyone was home, my voice sounding thin and pathetic against the roar of the storm outside. From the corner of the room, I heard it. A sound like wet leather being dragged across a floor. Then, a voice. It was a low, rattling wheeze, like someone trying to speak through a throat full of gravel and phlegm. It just said one word, inside. I was so relieved to not be alone that I didn't even process how wrong that voice sounded. I fumbled in my pack for my flashlight, but my hands were so numb I couldn't get the tactical switch to click. I just kept apologizing, telling the shadow in the corner that I'd be gone by morning, that I just needed to dry out. The voice didn't say anything else for a long time. It just made this wet, clicking sound every time it inhaled. I didn't want to intrude further, so I just huddled down right there by the door. I pulled out my emergency bivy bag and crawled in, still shivering so hard my teeth were clicking together. I remember looking around the room as my eyes adjusted to the dark. There were shapes hanging from the rafters, long, heavy bundles wrapped in what looked like dirty canvas or cured hides. I told myself it was just dried meat. Deer, maybe. Elk. I had to believe that. I must have drifted off into that heavy, dead sleep you get when you're on the verge of exhaustion. But I woke up when the sun started to bleed through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. It wasn't a bright morning light, it was a dull, grayish tint that made everything in the cabin look like a grainy photograph. That's when I noticed the smell had changed. It was stronger now. It was the scent of something sweet and rotting, mixed with the sharp, acidic stench of industrial lye. I looked toward the corner where the voice had come from, expecting to see an old hermit in a rocking chair. What I saw instead, I don't think I'll ever be able to unsee it. There was a man there, but he wasn't sitting in a chair. He was chained to a heavy iron ring bolted directly into the floor timbers. He was naked, but his skin, it didn't look like skin anymore. It was covered in these thick, jagged black stitches, like someone had tried to quilt together pieces of different people to cover his frame. His eyes were gone, just hollowed-out sockets that had been sewn shut with heavy-duty fishing line, but the line had snapped on one side, leaving one lid fluttering like a dead moth's wing. He was hunched over a pile of something on the floor. At first, I thought he was repairing a coat. Then I realized he was eating. He was holding a human forearm, stripped of most of its meat, and he was gnawing on the elbow joint with teeth that had been filed down into sharp, jagged points. I tried to scream, but my throat felt like it was filled with broken glass. I scrambled backward, hitting the door, but it wouldn't budge. I turned around and pulled at the handle, but the heavy iron bolt on the outside had been slid home. I was locked in. The thing in the corner stopped chewing. It tilted its head, the stitches on its neck straining until I could see the raw, red meat underneath the thread. It didn't have a tongue. It had been replaced with a jagged piece of carved bone that it used to manipulate the air. Fresh, it wheezed. That same voice from the night before. He brings fresh. I looked up at the rafters then. The bundles hanging from the ceiling weren't canvas. They were human torsos, expertly skinned and drained, swaying gently in the draft from the door. Some of them were still dripping. A slow, rhythmic thump-thump started coming from the floorboards beneath me, and I realized there was a cellar. Someone very much alive and very much human was down there, and they were the one who had bolted the door from the outside. They were the one who had harvested these people and sewn this nightmare together. The thing on the chain started to crawl toward me, its limbs moving at angles that no human joints should allow. It dragged its heavy iron chain with a sound that set my nerves on fire. It wasn't fast, but it was relentless. It kept whispering fresh over and over again, its one open eye socket fixed on my throat. I didn't have a weapon. All I had was my heavy internal frame pack. As the thing lunged, I swung the pack with everything I had. The heavy metal frame caught the creature square in the face, and I heard the sickening crunch of its facial bones collapsing. It didn't scream. It just let out a wet, whistling sigh and slumped back, its stitched together skin tearing open to reveal gray, necrotic muscle. I didn't wait. I grabbed a heavy iron fire poker from the hearth and jammed it into the gap between the door and the frame. I pried with a strength I didn't know I had, but would screaming and splintering until the external bolt snapped off the siding. I tumbled out into the snow, the cold air hitting my lungs like a physical blow. I didn't look back, but as I ran down the slope, I saw him. A man was coming up the trail. He was wearing a bright yellow raincoat and carrying a heavy canvas bag and a meat saw. He looked like any other hiker, totally normal, totally average. But as we passed each other, he didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask why I was covered in blood and grime. He just smiled, a wide, polite, terrifying smile, and tipped his hat. Leaving so soon, he asked, "The stew is almost ready." I didn't stop running until I hit the highway 3 miles down. I told the police I got lost and fell into a ravine. I told them the blood on my pack was from a deer I'd found. Because if I told them the truth, that there's a cabin up there where a man is sewing people together and feeding them. Scraps to a blind, chained God, they put me in a padded room. But sometimes, when it rains, I swear I can hear that wet, clicking sound in my hallway. And I know that the man in the yellow raincoat is still out there, looking for more fresh material to finish his quilt.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.